So choose Spanish or English. I would like especially to thank ASPA Institute as our partner and everyone that joined us today and has this compromise for support and participate with motivation to promote South-South engagement, further research in this field. This conference will examine the importance and pertinence of institutions as Caroline Center, the study of Lebanese diaspora in the Americas, and address some of the later books of PhD Professor Carter, among other topics. And now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for this section, Jorge Araneda, PhD of International Relations Middle East from Ankara University. Jorge, that's your turn.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the current event hosted by Foro del Sur and ASPA Institute. And as well as my colleague, I want to take the opportunity to thank our hosting institutions for allowing us for this event. First of all, obviously, to Marlita Leska and Foro del Sur, executive director of this institution, as well to ASPA Institute. But last but not least, I want to take a moment to recognize our partner institution as like Alada Chile and his president Joaquin Saez, Alada International, and Adolfo Ibáñez University, his Faculty of Liberal Arts, and the professor PhD Diego Melo, and of course the Intérprete Digital. Furthermore, for me, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Akram Hader, Professor of History of North Carolina State University, where we also serve as the director of Moises Hayradallah Center of Lebanese Studies Diaspora. You can find his main research, Embrace the Divine, Gender, Passion, and Politics in the Christian Middle East, published in 2011. Sources, the classic now, Sources of History of the Middle East in its second edition in 2010, and Inventing Home, Migration, Gender, and the Mankind of the Lebanese Middle Class in 2001. His professional affiliation include the Middle East Study Association, Arab American Study Association, American Academy of Religion, and the American Historical Association. And he's also in the board of the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and special, for me particularly, in the board of the Magyar Journal. As well as, first of all, I want to remind as well that this conference and this session, you can follow simultaneously in Facebook Live, but as well you can follow us in Twitter, Facebook, and where you can find more materials, articles, and other activities. We encourage all of you to switch your video on. While this meeting are not a replacement in any case or a physical meeting with the Professor Adam Hader, a face-to-face meeting is encouraged, and for that reason we will ask and we'll trying to encourage that we can see our own faces. It's great to see more than 30 people engaging for all parts of the world. The format of this conference is that this will be a 60 minutes meeting or talk with the Professor Hader in order to be considerate and respectful to everyone attending to the presentation today. All the attendees are muted, and if you are not muted, please mute yourself. We will have designed a time for address question, but if you may submit question or inquiries in any time during the session. To submit a question to our panelists, please enter to the question in the Q&A text box, and please let us know your name and your location, please. It's now giving me a great pleasure to hand the meeting over to Professor Hader, who has come along today to share his previous research, experience, and findings. In the recent, for this occasion, I will try to engage with the Professor Hader, asking, first of all, not just about his personal career. For my knowledge, he spent most of all his, until previous to engaging bachelor or lisan in university, he was living in Beirut, and he spent all his teenager, grew up in Beirut, or I think he was moving from one city to another one, but in the end, he ended up in Beirut. But as well, after he moved to US, I want to know especially how he engaged with the diaspora, like a topic for in terms of like engage, and as well, how was the founded idea of the Moises Hiram Center of Lebanese Diaspora Studies? How this career and center on together at some point?
Thank you so much, Jorge, and thank you for the Fundación Foro del Sur for hosting this. Maglis, thank you so much for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody. It is truly an honor and a privilege to join you. I am very heartened by the interest you have here. As Jorge was saying, I was born and raised in Lebanon, and during the Lebanese Civil War, like many people of my generation, and unfortunately many people of later generations in various parts of the world, it was necessary that I leave the place where I was born and raised to seek education in the United States. I had the good fortune and privilege of getting a scholarship from an institution in the United States. So I was able to leave in that regard. I had not thought about leaving before, although my grandfather had gone to Uruguay and lived in Uruguay for about 10 years before he came back to Lebanon. And from what I understand, I have cousins there. And in fact, I found their names in one of the directories from 1938. It's an Argentinian directory, actually, but it listed people in Uruguay for Arabic speakers. Anyway, so I ended up in the United States. And in many ways, I did what a lot of young boys from the Arab world do. I studied engineering. It was either to be a doctor or an engineer. And I was sick of blood after a civil war in Lebanon, so I opted to be an engineer. But I discovered very quickly that I'm much more interested in the humanities, particularly history. And I think in some ways my interest in that comes from two parts. One, growing up in the midst of civil war, and I know many of you in Argentina grew up in certain difficult times as well. I think history is an incredibly powerful tool to understand why things happened, and without necessarily being too deliberate about the matter. I think that's what drove me to history. I needed to understand why a country that I grew up in that was, from my childhood, quite idyllic. I mean, obviously I was a child, so I wasn't really aware of the intricacies, but it certainly was a wonderful life in many ways. All of a sudden devolves into this horrendous civil war where the very fabric of society is shredded. Neighbors are killing neighbors. Brothers are turning against each other. And then all of a sudden, about 1 million people between 1975 and 1990 were forced to leave the country to seek somewhere else. So I think that's what drove me to history. And I left engineering, although I was working as an engineer, I left it. And I did my PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, for that reason. The second part of my own condition as a person who had to leave and travel to a very foreign country. Of course, I knew America or the United States through popular culture. Well, I'm sure all of you who share that experience to a certain extent or another. Television, music, movies, those were familiar. But really, I did not know America, nor did I have a mental image of what it was really like. So my own journey as an immigrant into an environment that alternating between being kind and hospitable to being hostile and rejecting. Also, forced me to ask questions about what is the source of, this kind of antagonism towards immigrants? Why do people dislike immigrants? What is the immigrant experience, and what does it mean to be an immigrant? And I think these kind of questions together led me to my first book project, which is to understand those who left between 1870 and 1920, 26, and came to the Americas. My focus is primarily on the United States, but all these people were going to the Americas, Argentina being one of the largest recipients, Brazil and the United States, but everywhere in between, and Australia and sub-Saharan Africa. Why did these people leave at that time period? But more importantly, I really was very dissatisfied with the way I understood immigration. I think for a lot of times people understand immigrants as once they leave a place and they arrive at another, as if there is no continuing relationship between where they left. And I was very dissatisfied with that. Personally, because I was always connected to Lebanon. But even historically and theoretically, that did not make sense. So what intrigued me about immigration isn't just so much why people left, but rather the circulation of human beings. So many people would end up in Cuba, then Florida, then Texas, or they would be in California, they would end up in Buenos Aires. So clearly there's a circulation. And more importantly, they were constantly connected to the Middle East. Newspapers, letters, travels, commodities, clothing, objects, food. There was a constant circulation of people, ideas. So to me, when I started this project, it was really about that kind of circulation and how that changes the Middle East and how it changes the places that you see now. So that's kind of where we started. Now, 10 years ago, I don't know how many of you are of Arab heritage, but I'm sure if you are, you're familiar with Tabbouleh and Dabki. You know, every time some heritage community gets together for Independence Day, for New Year's Eve, for Valentine's, there's Tabbouleh and Dabki. So a good friend of mine, his name is Moïse Khairallah. And for those of you who want to pronounce it, it's a French pronunciation of Moses. So it's Moïse. And Moïse and I were having coffee, and another event was coming up within the Lebanese community in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live. And sure enough, it was going to be Tabbouleh and Dabki again. And Moïse said, you know, I'm so tired of this. Can we do something different? And I said, sure. Moïse has done very well for himself in pharmaceuticals, or legal drugs, as I like to call them. And I said, we would be happy to do a project in which we collect oral histories from recent and more distant Lebanese immigrants to North Carolina, the state where I am. And on the basis of that, we will do a documentary and then do a museum exhibit. And we did both. And what was really interesting is that aside from that, the documentary you can see on the website of the center, LebaneseStudies.ncsc.edu. What was really mostly interesting is this. So with the very sage advice of my wife, we first premiered the film in the North Carolina Museum of History. And we had a lot of people show up. At the end of the film, and I can tell you right now, and I'm not being overly modest, the film wasn't that great. It was my first attempt to make a documentary, and I look at it now and I can see all sorts of problems. But people were crying at the end of it. And it wasn't because I was such a brilliant filmmaker, not at all. They were crying because finally the story so that they have been telling each other around their kitchen table, in their living room, in the meetings when they went go have Tabbouleh and Dabki. These stories about 160 years of Arab presence in the United States are being screened at the North Carolina Museum of History. It's almost validated that they have been there for a long time. Now, to understand that moment, you also have to understand that all this was happening after 9/11, when in the United States, being Arab was considered to be the equivalent of being terrorist. So there is already that kind of sense, and finally to have our story told, that we didn't arrive on 9/11, we didn't arrive in the 20th century, we arrived in the 19th century. And people were crying because it finally said, there's something to our story that is actually built America. And one could, by the way, argue that Arabic-speaking immigrants have been in the United States since the 1600s. You have to remember that amongst the slaves that were brought into the United States, and we have diaries of some of them, there were many Arabic-speaking Muslims. So this is not a novel thing. But to see these elements, that we are part of this fabric, was very powerful, because everything was telling Arabs and Muslims in America that they don't belong. They are the other. And so that very powerful moment in which we screened the film, and then about a year later, at the same place, at the North Carolina Museum of History, we had the exhibit, and we had thousands of people come through convinced Moise that this is something he wants to do, and I was already convinced, beyond North Carolina. We wanted to expand to the United States and South America eventually. And at that time, he was generous enough to provide the university with a lot of money. I don't mean to be crass. I don't mean to imply that money is everything. But I told him, because when he approached me, he said, let's do something bigger. I said, sure, I would love to. However, and I think this is important for everybody to understand, because heritage and memory and history takes funding. I told him I am not going to go to people and say, give me the most precious thing you have, your memories, your stories. But I'm not sure if I'm going to be here next year or the year after. I said, that will not work. I can't do it. It's unethical. If we are to build a center dedicated to preserving the history of the Lebanese, and by the way, I'm using the term Lebanese in a very loose term. Really what we're talking about are Arabic speakers from the Eastern Mediterranean. That includes Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese, as we understand it today. I said to him, if we are going to do that, if I am going to tell people, please give me the most precious thing you have, your stories and your memories, I want to make sure that we are going to be here forever. And so he endowed the center. I don't know how familiar you are with the American educational system, but an endowment is a large sum of money that is given to the university. And every year it generates a certain amount of income. And so it is in perpetuity forever, the center will exist. And that is what we have been doing for the past 6 years. Sorry, I went on for long, but I wanted to provide a little bit more context for future questions.
No, it's remarkable, not just the work of the center, as well as the products that for a general public, not just thinking or engage just in academics, for academics. That is part of the job, but it's not all. In that regard, and especially when anyone who tried to address your first book, we need to deal with two different questions or two different background. First, in terms of our we our researchers, how in your experience can be addressed the different educational backgrounds of these migrants who go to America or the Americas, especially when you have a huge gap between the urban and rural experience that need to be translated in the Americas with different experience, different set of skills, and as well with different perspective of what will be America. That is one of the main issue in the book that try to address, and if you can explain that, will be very good. The other thing is in the other part, not just in the academic part, in the community part. The community part engage with this narrative that are so precious, but they tend to be very selective in this narrative. For good or bad, most of this narrative, not just in Americas or in the Americas, as well in the Levant, they have this focus in just this prosperity of men and women who maybe return, maybe not. Someone traveled. I remember some example of these huge clocks that they buy it and send it or go with them. Or another example is, for example, a Ford car that they as well go to Lebanon with a huge car where there is no road in the rural area, but for engaging just social capital in the prosperity and say, look, I made it.
Yeah.
How we can deal with these two aspects? Our aspect like academics, but as well the narrative of the community.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, by the way. It's a really very, very probing and thoughtful question. And thank you so much for bringing this up. I'm going to start answering with an anecdote. So I left Lebanon in 1978. I was about 17 years old. And the first time my sister came to see me was a full professor at university. I live in a modest house. It's a very small house. It's about 120 square meters. We raise a family in it. It's modest. It's nothing rich. You know, university professors in the United States aren't wealthy. So my sister came to visit me from Lebanon. This was probably about 10 years ago. And I picked her up from the airport, and we were driving, and we drive through several neighborhoods. We start out with this huge houses, you know, what they call in the United States McMansions, these massive houses that are 500, 600, 700 square meters. And I drive, and she's looking like, oh, are we stopping here? And I keep driving. Then we go to the next one, and then the next one. And then finally we get to our house. And it gets smaller and smaller until we get to our house, which is one of the smallest houses even in our neighborhood. And then she looks at the house, says, you've been here for 30 years and that's all you got? You know, so like, you know, there is what you just said is really true. The narrative, so as much as the United States, I'm going to speak here very specifically because that's where I do my research. The narrative of the immigrants is always suspicious, right? Every now and then you have this notion, oh yeah, we have good immigrants. They come and work hard. But generally speaking, whether we're talking about, you know, immigrants from Mexico or Central America, immigrants from China or East Asia, or immigrants from the Middle East, there's always a suspicion. It's a suspicion about their culture. It's a medical suspicion. They bring diseases. It's a are they criminals? So there is always this, they're met as if they don't belong, and they're kept at an arm's length. So the flip side of that is that the community itself begins to develop a narrative of the good immigrant. In order for them to argue, we belong in America, in the United States, they claim that they are the good immigrants. They never break the law, they always work hard, and they are always successful. That becomes the community narrative. And that is, by the way, very much driven by this notion that they have to explain and excuse their presence there. And this is very common. You see it in Australia and New Zealand, in West and South Africa. You see it, of course, in Mexico, and you see it in the United States. This idea, this narrative that's generated by the community itself. The problem with both narratives, that of the immigrant as the suspicious other, the criminal, the disease-bringing, the law-breaking individual, or the one on the other side, the community one, that we are fantastic and there's nothing other wrong. They are completely ahistorical. They reduce the immigrant experience and immigrants themselves to a two-dimensionality that is not real. Because the fact of the matter is, immigrants are as human as anybody else. And in fact, one of the reasons we should insist on telling the full story of immigrants, including when they fail, including when they act outside the law, including when they are very imperfect in terms of their marriage, in terms of the way they raise children, including all their imperfections. We must tell the full story because we must reclaim their humanity. Because if we allow them to only become immigrants, good or bad, that becomes nothing more than a category that places them outside the legal, outside the political, social bounds and cultural bounds of the state and society. Because immigrant becomes somebody outside. Unless we show the full human experience of the immigrants, then they will never become human. There will always be something there, good or bad. So for me, I'll give you an example. One of the narratives that develops, especially in the United States, amongst descendants of immigrants and immigrants themselves from the early phase, is that they left the Middle East because they were escaping persecution by los Turcos, right? The Ottomans, the Turks are persecuting us. And of course, the term Turk is a stand-in for Muslims. Muslims are persecuting Christians, so Christians are escaping in that regard. The reality is obviously far more complicated, and we can get into the history, but suffice it to say, the historical record does not show that to be the case at all. Most people left because they were seeking an economic opportunity that would make money and then go back and be comfortable in their countries. But aside from that, so once I was giving a presentation, this was in Houston, Texas, and I was making the argument that this narrative about why people left is too simplistic. There's a lot more detail to it. And I was giving an example. And this one person stood up and they were very upset. They were angry, actually. And he yelled at me, he said, "Are you meaning to tell me that my grandmother lied to me?" And I said, look, I do not know your grandmother, and I'm sure she's a wonderful human being, and I'm sure she wasn't lying. But what I'm saying is this is a narrative. However, he was not convinced, because it really attacked the very core of his whole life story. But the problem is, he was dependent on this idea that immigrants were all good. And that is simply not true. It's just simply not a historical reality. So from the very outset, I'm not saying that we started putting our mission is not to go and tell counter stories. Our mission is to engage the community. Because one of the things that I find very problematic, I don't know about Argentina or Brazil or South America in general, but in the United States, university professors have become isolated from the general public. We have abandoned the public sphere, and there's a price to pay for that. The price is the public sphere now is occupied by demagogues who know nothing, but they are speaking in populist terminology that is driving this world closer and closer to wars. And that is our fault. That is, I mean, listen, I after 9/11 in 1 year, I gave 200 talks. So I'm very much a public intellectual in that regard, but we need to do more. So from that very outset, to answer your question, the other part of your question, when we conceived of the center, of the Moïse Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies, and we thought about building an archive, I did not want it to be an archive that is exclusive to academics. I did not want to create an archive that alienates the general public. Instead, I wanted to engage them. So a lot of the projects, and we do it in two ways. One is when we're building the archive, and by the way, I don't mean to tell you this, but let me make it, just to put it out there. Building an archive as a political project, because archives give voice, but they also silence. So we're constantly asking ourselves, who are we silencing, even as we give voice? And so to counter the natural notion of this kind of hierarchical archive in which the archivist says what you see, what you don't, we wanted to engage the community to tell us what they wanted to archive. So that's one. But two, we wanted to engage in what we call public history. History that engages the community in a conversation. I'll give you an example of that. Last year, we did a documentary, and I have to say this is better than the first one, about lynching. A violent killing of a Lebanese couple in 1929 in Lake City, Florida. They were killed because they were brown. They were not white. And because they challenged the local police authority. So they were killed and lynched. So we told their story. And it was a very, very interesting, because their descendants were split. Some of their descendants wanted nothing to do with the story. They wanted to completely put it to the side because they were afraid that if the story comes out, it's going to bring up, bad feelings, open up old wounds. Other members of the family said, no, we must tell the story. So when we told the story, we actually had a conversation with the family. We debated back and forth, but we also had a community conversation. And ultimately, we made the film in such a way that you can take it into a classroom, whether you're talking about a high school or a university. It's only 26 minutes, and have a conversation about it. We released all the archives that we built it on, and we tried to engage teachers with it. So we had workshops. So that's what we constantly do with our projects. We are always public facing. We want people to be engaged with the archive, to shape it and play around with it. And because we believe that's the only way that we are going to re-engage the public in the story about immigration.
I need to ask in this regarding to this experience. The first migrants that arrived to Latin America, but particularly to areas when there was this ongoing institutional capitalism or industrial modernity, especially in Argentina, but more like vivid in United States. How was the experience about this transformation of a more confessional identity. Like it's not so important, like especially the class, less the race. When I write to US, I need to deal with another set of classification, another set of framework. And for that reason, they need to create a new individuality in this new body of migrant, or in this body of part of the Levant, from Lebanon or Jordan or Palestine, but as well to be part of our very structural class and a very defined race. In that research, how was this experience with the first migrants?
Sure. So as part of the narrative that was developed, I would say, by the community itself, the idea was that they came, they started their work as peddlers, they became merchants and entered the middle classes, and everybody was successful. That's kind of the very streamlined, simplistic story. Now, the story is not by accident, because if you look at the trajectory, it's a trajectory of entrepreneurs, right? I mean, and in the United States hyper-capitalist model, entrepreneur is like the god of the capitalist model. It's this story, what they call Horatio Alger, the person who works hard, build themselves up, and they succeed, right? I mean, so what they were telling was an Arab version of Horatio Alger, that, you know, we did it, we succeeded, we worked hard. But there's also a race dimension. What I mean by that is, to be part of the middle class, to succeed, to become a merchant, was in essence a gateway to whiteness. Because when they arrived, they were not white. They existed in what's called the liminal state. They were neither black, and it's because the American racialized system was, you know, there's black and there's white, and then Italians, and before them the Irish, and then the Poles and people from Eastern Europe, and certainly Arabs, were neither white nor black, and so they really kind of existed in no man's land. And so the economic upward mobility, or the politics of respectability to become middle class, was a gateway to becoming white, because whiteness had privileges in America. Privileges of being protected by the law, privileges of, you know, more power, economic, social, and cultural. And so they built this very narrative. In reality, however, like everything else, it's far more complex. At one point or another, nearly 40% of those who came worked in what we would consider a factory. In other words, they were working class. And in fact, one of the largest and the first and largest strike in American labor history is called Bread and Roses strike, which happened in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in the textile industry, which in Brazil, there's a big textile industry, a lot of strikes there as well, was in many ways led by the Syrians, as they were called. They were overrepresented in the leadership of the strike. But what is really interesting is right after the strike and World War I, this kind of labor activism that was very prominent, very dissipated as they entered into the suburbs and began to live a middle-class life. So what I'm saying here is that it's a far more complex story, because they attempted in many ways to fight against a racialized system. They attempted to fight against a capitalist system. But for a good number of them, they decided that they're not going to succeed. So the best thing to do is to try to integrate into those systems. So their story really kind of goes from one side to the next. This doesn't mean that they didn't continue to work. You know, for example, if you look at the mining towns, we're talking about coal, gold, silver, and this is all in the western part of the United States: New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah. There were a lot of them who were working in these minefields and involved in labor politics. But, and they continue to be so. But after a while, that involvement in labor politics labeled them as non-white. And so you begin to see them retreat away from that. So this is, in essence, what they had to face. They had to learn how to navigate a racist and a racialized system, and a capitalist system, with both of which they were not familiar with. So you end up with a part of this community that becomes middle class, and that community tells the narrative. And this is why it's important to build archives that go against the grain archives that tell different stories. Because if you look at most of the newspapers, and by the way, whether they are published in Buenos Aires or in Rio or in New York, most of newspapers are catering to the middle classes of the immigrant community. If we just depend on these newspapers, they will tell us one part of the story, the politics of respectability, in essence, how they became integrated into mainstream society. It doesn't tell us about all the other people. It doesn't tell us about gays and lesbians within the community. It doesn't tell us about people who became socialists. It doesn't tell us about people who fought against the racist system all their lives. Nor does it tell us about the alliances many of them built with indigenous populations, like in North Dakota and South Dakota, or with Mexican immigrants in Texas and Arizona. All these stories disappear, and all we are left with, we came, we worked hard, we became full Americans. And that's the end of the story. Race, gender, class are completely out of the picture. And without those, we really don't understand the struggles they made and the differences that they made. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, especially because, for example, in Latin American experience, we don't have this so racial spectrum, like institutionalized, but class for sure. And we can see this in the newspaper. I remember seeing the archive in Chile, in the Arab community. You can see how they trying to engage in this new mode of be middle class. For example, pictures with in certain clothes, taking vacations. That is a very middle class at the beginning of the century, have the possibility to go to a beach or take some time free, and because the workers didn't have that option. And as well to engage in reproduce this kind of narrative of be an entrepreneurs, especially in his own homes that end like a mini, like a small museums that they take picture of this. Like I buy this, I have a clock, I have a carpet, I have a huge table. Like this is my all my things that I can show, and that is mean that I have an amount or a significant amount of capital, and that creates a narrative, and that is a thing that we need to understand when we deal with newspaper. The narrative is not just the reproduction of the narrative is not just in the words, as well in the image that we deal.
Yes, sure.
Particularly with this, in this like understanding of the otherness, like between all the migration in US, and especially this kind of contra narrative, or the people who didn't success in the turn of his own narrative, how this diaspora study how can interlock, can help us to understand we own narrative in terms of nationalism or national studies or development in, for example, in the United States, when in the construction of the states don't appear this migrant who didn't success.
So for a long time, I think, and this is a problem I find within immigration studies, and we're still trying to sort it out. We look at immigration as a state of exceptional being, right? It stands outside the very definition of the nation state of which you spoke, right? I mean, that's the idea of borders, passport control, nationalism. All of these things exclude immigrants and put them outside as an exceptional element to this. And it makes the immigrant this kind of category that just stands out there. But the reality is, if you look at how most people immigrate, really in many ways, immigration becomes nothing more than another strategy that people adopt amongst a whole series of strategies for a better life in one way or the other. In other words, this decision to go from point A to point B is really becomes much more legible, much more easy to understand if you situate it within what a lot of human beings do, is how do I actually make my life a little bit better. Getting an education, getting another job, moving, having different social network. All of these are strategies in which people adopt in order to make their lives better. Now, once you situate immigration within this matrix of human strategies for self-improvement and improvement of their conditions of their family, then again, the immigrant stops being outside the national experience. Because then it becomes legible, and most people begin to understand, oh, I get what this is all about, right? I mean, putting it very simplistically, in the United States today, and I'm not sure if in Argentina and Brazil are you having the same conversation, but certainly in the United States, I'm sure you're aware, there's a very vitriolic, violent conversation about immigrants. It's not almost, it is very reminiscent of the 1920s, when we have a very strong anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, embodied by the Ku Klux Klan, which becomes very popular in the 1920s in the United States. So today we're having a similar thing. And when you look at how, if you watch Fox News or any right-wing conservative representation of immigrants, it is very illustrative, because they are seen as this group of people in their thousands invading America and threatening America. There is no humanity there. They are seen as people that are threatening to it. And what's really interesting, I've had conversations with descendants of early Arab immigrants who now turn around and look at these new immigrants and say, oh, no, these are terrible. They're not like us. I'll give you a very quick example without names, obviously. I was speaking to somebody, and they were saying, when my grandparents immigrated from Lebanon, they assimilated. This term assimilated becomes such a powerful notion, because idea is assimilated is you basically take everything that made you who you were, throw it off, your language, your clothes, your food, your ideas, your values, everything, your religion, everything that made you who you are, and you put it to the side, and then you take upon yourself being American, whatever that means. Playing baseball, eating apple pie, going to, barbecue, pork, whatever it is. So there's this notion. So I said to this person who was speaking to me, I said, oh, that's very interesting that you say that. I said, so, did they begin attending Protestant churches? She said, oh, no. They remain Catholic because, that's their faith. I said, okay. Did they, were they fluent in English, your grandparents? She said, no, they still had broken English. They preferred to speak in Arabic, right? So you go down this list of supposed, and clearly what happens, and by the way, we have sociological studies that show this, today's immigrants integrate at the same rate as immigrants 100 years ago. But in her mind, these immigrants don't assimilate, the old ones assimilate. And she regards assimilation as very positive. But in fact, when you tell the story of immigration, and I'll tell it in a very kind of silly way, when I first arrived in the United States in 1978, I arrived in a place called St. Paul, Minnesota. For those of you who don't know Minnesota, it's a wonderful state, but in the winter, it's like the Siberia of America. It's cold. And I remember one day I was at the college where I was attending, McAllister College, and there was this excitement. And I wasn't sure what the excitement was about. And then somebody says, hey, they are opening Taco Bell. For those of you who are outside the United States and our fast food chains, Taco Bell is Mexican food. It's not. It's its own Tex-Mex fast food. And there was a sense of excitement. Now, I mention this because, in essence, that was the level in the late 1970s, early 80s. That's the food notion. That exotic was Taco Bell. Today, of course, you cannot go to any middle-sized or even small-sized city in the United States without encountering a much more variety of food that is brought by immigrants. Now, I mentioned this kind of silly example because immigrants profoundly change, and I would argue for the better in many ways, especially at the level of the culinary taste of America. They change the very structure of their place of life. They don't assimilate, because assimilation assumes that they give up everything they are. But they actually insist on retaining a sense of who they are, even when they create a narrative saying that we assimilated. I mean, that's the tension. The irony, the ironic tension in their stories is that they actually are transforming the society they arrive at. Of course, they're transforming themselves, but they insist that they assimilated, even when they have clearly have maintained a sense of who they are, a sense of self. So, for example, I mean, if you go to eastern part of North Carolina, where I live, the eastern part of the state, which is close enough, the Catholic Church was established by immigrants, right? And today, of course, the Catholic Church in the South is growing because of immigrants from Central America and Mexico, right? It's not the Irish, it's not the Italians. It is primarily people who are from the Eastern Mediterranean and, of course, Central South America. So this notion of assimilation that becomes the code word for good immigrant versus bad immigrant is really completely a false argument, because they are really changing, as immigrants have always changed in this country.
Yeah, but particularly is so like deeply, like there is a lack of understanding as well as a lack of like research, particularly in Latin America, in some especially in some countries, that they make his own national history so wide, and not just dealing with the indigenous population, as well, not dealing with the migrant, but especially this kind of classification of that migrant that was not the European one,
Right.
was this other, or this otherness that appeared in the migration table, in the census, for example.
Sure.
In that regard, I would like to highlight the special key components of the oral history, not just for the community, but as well for this Magyar community that was like not just dealing in, because there was contact between the communities, the Arab communities. In South America, we have like a lot, like hundreds of articles who was printed in Brazil or Honduras or in Mexico or in Brazil, or for example, in Argentina, and was published in Chile. And that means that was the connection, was a discussion. But that discussion wasn't not just subscribed just in the words or in the newspaper. As well, there was a discussion in terms of his oral history. And that oral history was a huge component that in many regards is not registered like the newspaper, but is there and is waiting for us, like researchers, to deal with that and trying to compare with the newspaper or with another kind of narrative. And for that reason, how was the experience of dealing with this oral history for the documentaries and for the books?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that's the reason why we need to build a more complete archive. So first of all, let me say something. I think we're upon the cusp. We're just getting to the point, including your work, I would say, in which we have a new generation of scholars that is emerging, that is working a lot more on South America than North America. Aside from a lot of public-facing projects we do, as you know, the center publishes a scholarly journal called Mashraq al-Mahjar, which publishes studies of migration studies, and we host a conference, as well as we have graduate student workshops to help graduate students work on their dissertation, especially in these difficult times when it's very hard to get to archives. We had at the beginning of September, we had 9 graduate students mostly from the United States, but a lot from, there's one person from Brazil, Diego Bercito, and 3-4 people from the UK and 1 person from France. What is really interesting is 2/3 of them were working on South America. And so this is a new phenomenon. I mean, obviously my colleague Lily Badofé, Stacey Forenthal, and John Karam, who just published a book on Arabs in Brazil. There's already an older generation of people working on this, but I think the younger generation is doing several things. One, there's a lot more work being done, period. 2, they are very conscious about intersectionality. That is, you cannot study immigration without understanding race, gender, and class, as we have been talking about. They are very sophisticated. I mean, I look upon them with great admiration because they are sophisticated theoretically, but also they are reaching out to archives, back to your point, Jorge, to different archives. They're not satisfied to simply accept the state archive or the middle class archive. They are collecting oral histories. They're uncovering personal archives in which the photos that you talked about, or even objects, prayer books of some sort, people write marginalia. So there's something that I find that is growing very fast. It is very promising in terms of the next wave of immigration studies. And I think what's also interesting is we are going beyond. So for the longest time, including my own work, which is, I think, is a weakness, we study immigrants vis-a-vis the hegemonic society. That is, in the United States, we study Arabs and their relationship to the white Anglo-Saxon society, right? So we create this kind of hierarchical study in which all these immigrant communities arrive and they are all dealing with an Anglo-Saxon hegemonic society, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants as they are known. I think what is emerging, the next, aside from intersectionality, the other thing that is emerging that I find very promising, and again goes back to this oral history, is cross-ethnic relations. So for example, I'm working on, with my daughter, so it's kind of exciting because she's a historian of African American studies. I'm working on this book, but what it becomes apparent in the 60s is that Arabs and African Americans in the United States create alliances around Palestine. And you begin to see that they are doing with third world politics that are crossing all the way into South America and the revolutionary movement in South America. That is the kind of work that I think is also very promising. And the third vector, which I think is really important, and it's a project that I've undertaken with one of my graduate students, but I think it's not just me, I think a lot more people are working on it, comes under the title of the Immigrant Experience. So for the longest time, including my own early work, we look at macro history. So when we study why do people leave, we look at economic issues or political issues, but at the large level. And we lose sight of the immigrant as an individual, right? Because really when somebody makes a decision, as we talked about, as I said earlier, when we choose immigration as part of our strategy for a better life, it's a very complex formula. It's a very fluid, complex formula that gets us to the point that we decide, yes, I am packing my suitcase and I am leaving for 1 year, for 10 years, for 20 years. The chemistry of that decision is so human, so individual. And I think you begin to see a lot more focus on the human experience. And what that basically means is we're entering into the intimate lives of immigrants. We're not seeing immigrants from a distance as these categories moving across the Atlantic or the Pacific. We begin to understand them as people who cry because they are so desperately lonely when they arrive in a place like Oklahoma. I don't know if anybody's been to Oklahoma, but it would make anybody cry. We begin to encounter them through this intimate history, oral histories, photographs, letters, when they are having arguments across thousands of miles about how much money they're sending back home. I'm sure no immigrant here has ever encountered that problem. It's these issues that are so much at, the very personal, intimate level, enrich our understanding of immigration and immigrants, take us away from categories, and as I said earlier, humanize them. And for that, we have to build a very different kind of archive. We have to build an archive in which we have somebody capturing on an 8mm film a birthday party, just as silent, and you see them playing, and then maybe there's a little tension over the cake. It's that kind of archive that we're really trying to figure out how to do it. I'm not saying it's easy. I think it's very hard, actually, but it is necessary. And what you alluded to in terms of oral history, I think is absolutely correct. We can no longer depend on state archives or bourgeois archives. We have to depend on a greater variety of bring in voices. One of the people we are doing a project about is this woman who's so complex. I love her. I mean, she's amazing. She's lesbian. She lives with her partner for 35 years, and she tours literally practically every small town in the United States and Canada, preaching about Christianity, right? So here, this is, by the way, in the 1900 to 1920s. sorry, to 1930s. She's touring all of this. She's very clever. She understands Hollywood, so she makes a film and calls herself an Eastern princess. And she films herself on the columns of Baalbek. For those of you who have ever been to Lebanon, you know, there's a temple of Bacchus, and there are the 6 famous columns. So she films herself. This is in 1921, silent film era. Can you imagine how she got everything? And she creates a musical score with her lesbian lover. They tour and they speak. And then what is really fascinating about her, I mean, as you can tell, I'm very enamored with her, is she tells this predominantly white Protestant audience in churches that they understand nothing about Christianity because Christianity is from where she came from. And she is only entitled to speak for that. They have no right to speak about Christianity. I mean, bam, right? She's just like, and she is wildly popular. She's booked for a decade. So that's the kind of story we have to tell, because then we go beyond, yes, you know, Muhammad arrived, he worked as a peddler, he bought a store, and then he became a millionaire, right? I mean, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that story. You know, chapeau bas, as the French say. I tip my hat. But there's so much more to it. And back to your point, Jorge, for that, we have to build a different archive.
Yes, for sure. For sure, I think institutions that want to deal or want to engage with the Arab community need to open his door for different type of archive, like a more complex, as well as the life of the migrants in the Americas. For sure, I have hundreds of other questions that I would like to address. I will keep at this Q&A for hours, but I don't want to take more time of our professor. For that reason, I encourage every of you, if you have any question, please in the chat, you can write it in Spanish or in English. I will read for the professor, and I will try to open the floor for our guest. Particularly, I think because I am the host, I can have this mini power, dictatorial power here. I thought that there was a question of Marlies.
Yeah, I just want to like to know, I'm very happy with this event today. And I don't know, I noticed we have a very well-known scholars with us, like Nelida Borghidijan and Marcelo Huernos, a historian, but we have a lot of young people following this conference. So I was thinking, how do you think we can face this huge challenge to encourage those young people to maintain this tradition, this connection, sensitive connection with their family's origin? But in the other hand, they felt completely their identity is connected with their countries, like the people who grow up as born or grow up in America or in South American countries. How can you say that? What's your answer for this challenge?
You know, Marlies, that's such a wonderful question. And the reason I find it wonderful, not only is it because it's very profound, but because it's exactly a question that was asked in Argentina in 1930 by a young man who writes to the head of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, who lived in Argentina for a little bit, then he ended up in Brazil. And the question was from this young man in Buenos Aires, and I'm sorry, I forgot the young man's name. He was saying, how can I, you know, they call themselves Syrians, of course. How can I, as a Syrian born in Argentina, maintain my connection with Syria? How can I be here in Buenos Aires but maintain my connection with Syria? And of course, embedded in that question is the idea that there are two nationalisms that are separating, because that is how human beings were supposed to organize. I think at this point, one of the advantages we have, 90 years later, is that nationalism, I'm not saying it's disappeared. Obviously, it hasn't. In fact, ultra-nationalism seems to be making a frightening comeback in the United States as well as in other places like Brazil. But what is happening is the idea of transnationalism is becoming very accepted. That is, a human being doesn't have to belong to one nation. We can actually float, because until the 19th century, that is what human beings did. We actually existed in multiple places. I could be sitting in Sydney and making, Turkish coffee, and all of a sudden I'm transported because of that one aromatic moment. So I think we are at a moment that allows us to exist transnationally, and not only allows us, but in fact, I think there's an encouraging aspect in that regard. But there's a second part to the answer. I think a lot of times, and this is just from my observation as I travel a lot in the United States and give talks, the younger generation feels alienated from their parents' narrative because it doesn't feel like it's theirs. It feels stilted. It feels like it's already done. It feels like the story is complete. There's nothing else to write. And so why would I want to be part of the story if all you're telling me is something that is, a chapter that is completed? But I think when we create open-ended projects, that is, the story is not ended, it's not complete. There's a lot more to tell, both about the parents' generation, but especially about this generation, and about their relationship to their society. And I'll give you an example of one particular thing. Then all of a sudden, that generation comes around and comes alive. And I'll give you an example. Until the civil rights movement in the United States, the 60s, the 1960s, the idea of being Arab American in the United States was not commonplace. People either thought themselves as Lebanese or Syrian. But in the 1960s and 70s, engagement with the leftist politics, deeply flawed, but nonetheless leftist politics of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and the Middle East leftist movements, but more importantly with the civil rights in the United States, all of a sudden creates something called Arab American. And this younger generation whose parents said we're not Arab are all of a sudden taking upon them a new title. They're saying, no, I am Arab American. I belong to this and we're part of this movement. And interestingly enough, I find that with the Black Lives Movement that happened in the summer of 2020, Arab American generation, the second generation, all of a sudden became much more engaged politically and began to reach alliances to African American, Latinx, Asian American, and began to see commonality. And all of a sudden the story becomes theirs. So I think you see these very critical turning moments that allow for for this younger generation to make the story theirs. Otherwise, of course, they're not going to be interested in it. But at least very astute question. And I think it's a very critical question, by the way, for the future, not only academically speaking, but the future of the communities in general. I think there was a question about Phoenicianism. I'm sorry, I read Spanish, but very slowly, so I couldn't read all the stuff that was flying on the chat.
We have different questions. We have in our guests two professors that I know personally. One is Professor Hodor, former director of El Intérprete Digital, who asked this. Well, they say thank you for this remarkable conference, and he asked, my question is, what are some of the research and support offered by the Moises Hayrallah Center of Researchers interested in establish and contributed to an archive? That is the question.
Sure, it's a great question. So we can offer you a lot of food. I'm just kidding. I make very good tabbouleh. So for us, there's no single center or archive that is going to be able to do everything. So we believe in building networks. So I'll give you an example. We are working with the Arab American National Museum, who preceded us into this work, and they're wonderful people. Diana Abu Ali, Palestinian American, and Matthew Stifler, who himself descends of Lebanese immigrants. We work with them to build a network of archives and projects. We would very much love to work with any organization or individuals in Central South America along the same lines. So for example, in practical terms, we have just applied for a grant, that is the Arab American National Museum and the Hayrallah Center, to create a website that allows people to come in and search. and they can search for whatever they want, and then it tells them what we have and what the Arab American National Museum has. And our image is that we will make this an international portal that we bring in other archives and people can search from one place for material on Arab immigrants throughout the world. So that's one approach. The second approach, we are always, now, of course, COVID has created a problem for us, but we used to host scholars for 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks. We cover all their costs, travel, housing, and yes, food. And they come to the center. And if they are interested in using the archive, we work with them in the archive, but our archive is online. So it's really much more of a chance to have an intellectual conversation for them to spend some time. So that's another possibility. We are also very open to the idea of organizing conferences like this to open up conversation and probe questions. And the last element is that we also would be happy to host scholars for a semester or a year at North Carolina State University. So, I mean, I think we are trying to create that kind of community. Now, of course, the other element, as I said, is we publish this scholarly journal, Mashraq al-Mahjar. And although, of course, right now it's in English, but we actually believe very strongly that we have to publish in other languages. So I would invite anybody here, if you are publishing in Spanish, in Portuguese, in French, in Arabic, in Turkish, in Hebrew, we have people on the editorial board that can read the material and we'll send it out. And we will publish it in the original language with an English abstract. Because we very much believe that English cannot be an imperial language. And I'm sorry, here I am speaking in English, saying that. I am trying to learn Spanish because I believe Spanish is the second language of the United States, not a foreign language. I don't know why they put it in the foreign languages department. It's absurd. It should be a first language in this country. But I am trying to learn Spanish, but French and Arabic and English is my limit at this point. But I would encourage any of you that are interested in publishing. And finally, if I may say, academic scholarly work is very culturally located. So when I work with young scholars in the Middle East, their approach to scholarship is very different than the Anglo-Saxon world, which is very heavy in theory and analysis, so on and so forth. So for example, I was the editor of the International Journal of Middle East Studies, which is the flagship journal for about 5 years of the Middle East Studies Association. And we would get stuff from Iran, from Turkey, from Lebanon, from Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And most of it I would have to reject because actually the academic culture wasn't fitting within the journal's culture. So one of the things that we started doing is creating these workshops to say, look, if you want to publish in the British and American journals, this is what to expect. So we are happy to work with young scholars as well who would like guidance. And we do webinars regularly for these young scholars. So these are the various ways that we do. And I hope to come to Argentina very soon.
Excuse me, Professor, pay attention. Don't invite us too much because you have amount of people going through your university.
Ahla wa sahla. You are welcome.
Sorry, Jorge, we are out of time, but we have really very good questions that I will send to you, Professor. But I would like to finish with one, especially. I think it would be very important to have your answer. If Jorge allow me, it's from Odette Edie, and she asks you,
Professor Odette Edie from SOAS, yes.
Great. Can you hear? Okay. So she asked, where, how, and why did the myth of Phoenicianism among the Phoenicians among the Lebanese diaspora in the America, especially in the South, take form?
So interestingly enough, actually, Phoenicianism, and that is the idea that the Lebanese are direct descendants from Phoenicians, and they are not Arabs. And my brother is one of the people that used to believe in that, and he and I used to have arguments, and we would be arguing Arabic over this, not in Phoenician. But aside from the kind of silliness and the ironic aspect, I think Phoenicianism was much more prominent in the United States actually than in South America. South America, if you look at the sort of the intellectual literary circles, they very much like, for example, the circle of intellectuals and writers in Brazil and in Argentina were called the Andalusian group. Andalusia, of course, is kind of this utopian notion of when Arabs were prominent in the Iberian Peninsula. And so they harken back to the medieval times and Arab and Muslim era. For the North American writers, they called it Arabit al-Qalamiyya, which badly translated means the pen circle. And they were much more cognizant. So really, again, North America was much more embedded in this. I would argue that there are two ways in which Phoenicianism becomes very popular. First of all, it becomes a tool at a time when immigration was being closed off to people from the Eastern Mediterranean. It becomes a tool to say, we are not Arab, we are not Muslim, we are not Turk, we are very different. We belong in America at a racial level, at a cultural level. The second, and I think equally important, is the capitalist mode, because the whole myth of Phoenicians is that they were traders. They were born traders. And you know, the funny thing is, when I first got my job at North Carolina State University, one of my colleagues came up to me with all seriousness. We were in a department meeting. I was a junior faculty, so I was trying to keep quiet. And then there was a question, and they said, well, let's have Akram do this. That's me, Akram. Because, you know, he has Phoenician blood. He knows how to do trading. And I looked at him. I don't know where the heck that comes from, but no, dude. Me and business, we don't get along. So this idea, and there was a very famous article by Saloum Mkarsi in the New York Times, which appeared, in which he argues, why are Syrians, which is again what they call themselves, why are Syrians important to America? And he argues, because of their Phoenician roots, Syrians can be America's imperial agents in the brown countries of the world, including South America, where white people don't usually go. So in essence, then, this idea becomes A, we belong in American society because really we're not Muslim or Arab, and B, we really understand American capitalism because it's into our very cultural civilizational DNA. And I think, of course, there are organizations that begin to build around this idea and articulate this. And you know, I need to also add very quickly that at the same time that Phoenicianism is emerging, Zionism is also a very powerful nationalist movement that is premised on the idea that a group of people, in this case Jews, belong to a land exclusively. And so there was quite a bit of, not collaboration, but I think there was quite a bit of intellectual and philosophical meeting between the two groups. And Phoenicianism becomes that argument that becomes very popular amongst immigrants, just like Zionism becomes popular amongst Jewish immigrants in the United States.
What I can say, I need to thanks for all the question. I need to apologize as well, especially to all the attendants that write excellent question, but we are around of time. But for sure, you can contact. I am sure that you can contact Professor Hatter, and he can answer your inquiries, not just for the center, as well for researcher or research that you are currently engaged. I personally, I want to say like this was a wonderful topics, particularly because as well as in United States, that they are focused just in the Mahir, inside of United States. Latin American, we have the same problems. We are not speaking or we are not dealing with this more global history or more complex issue regarding to our own migration in South America and the interlock and the connection between them, especially when we have experience of migrants who live for a couple of years in one country and then start to move for all Latin American trying to set up. For that reason, I will thanks all the attendants for your participation, for your questions, and I'm sorry for not have the time to give a proper time for each of them. Marlies, please.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you to all your present today. I hope we enjoyed this conference as I did. It was really great. It was really a pleasure to reaffirm how important it is to reivindicate the heritage to make a society unique as we are as a cultural melting pot. If you have additional questions, please let us know. Send an email, or you can connect us through our social media platforms. Be sure everything we recorded and this conference is available in our YouTube channel. Thank you very much again. Hope to see you soon in another event. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.